Hi, and welcome to today's session on storytelling, engaging an audience through storytelling at the second day of Career Bootcamp 2021. So I'm Joshua Frame, I'm the National Chair of the Federal Youth Network, and it's a pleasure to have you all here with us today. I will begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am joining you from is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. I'll recognize as well that we have people, panelists and participants joining us from every possible place in Canada, and we are all on different ancestral territories. Marcella will add in the chat a link where you can check which territory you are on in your particular corner of Canada. So as we move through today's session, please share your questions by using the Q&A button. We have a lot of participants today, and the Q&A is your best and only place to put questions. And then if you have any comments or interactions, please share those in the chat function. Please share your comments as well and insights that you hear on today's session using the hashtag CBC_CDC on social media. And you can also tag the Federal Youth Network's Twitter account at FYN_RJFF. I will mention that today's session is entirely in English for this morning's panel. The French panel was hosted from 10 to 11 a.m. But if you have questions or comments, please feel free to use the language of your choice. But panelists will be responding in English. So today we have Jody Ray, who will be moderating the panel discussion. Jody is one of Canada's free agents, but more than that, she advocates for humanity in our communities and elevating human resources in our workplaces. She does this by cultivating and sustaining real, meaningful, and impactful human connections through strategic HR plans, training, and coaching. So welcome, Jody, and over to you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Josh. Love the intro. I wrote it, so I guess I should like it. I wanted to acknowledge that I am on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Katsi, Semiahmoo, Tawasin, and I'm forgetting the last one. Did I say Semiahmoo? Kwantlen Nations. Yes, so all four. I deliberately wanted to just share where I'm at because normally born and raised in Vancouver, BC, East Vancouver specifically, and then migrated into Surrey, BC. And then of late, last few years, just really wanting to hone in on acknowledgement of human connections and how it is that we come to be in where we're at. Before we have our panelists introduce themselves, which I'm super excited to have them do with you, we thought we would just set the stage. I think all of us have a pretty solid idea around when we say storytelling, what we mean. And what I would like to do is encourage you to think about storytelling as you've progressed as a human. So stories that you heard as a young child, the once upon a time stories, and the sort of influences of where those stories came from, and then turning the attention to stories that you would have heard from your ancestors and what that looked like and why those stories were being told, even to the point where when I was young, I never did that. And I find myself as a parent saying that to my kids, oh, did you know, when I was a kid that never happened. And most recently, a story that I shared with my daughter was around her wanting to make stuffies, very specifically not dolls, but stuffies. And I was able to share with her that I learned to sew from my mom, and my mom learned to sew from her mom, and her mom learned to sew from her mom. And so this idea about storytelling, not just being about saying something that's on your mind, but the connections that it can have and the intent behind the story is something that I would like you to consider and recognize, especially as we get into hearing about our panelists and their background and their responses to how storytelling has impacted them individually and how they've applied the idea of storytelling as it relates to their career. So with that in mind, I'd like to have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and I'd like to start with Yael.
Thanks so much, Jody. So we tried to challenge ourselves to see if we could tell our own stories in a minute. So here's mine. My name is Yaelberger. I go by the pronouns she, her, or elle in French. And I grew up loving to read and write. And so I decided when I went to university, I'm going to become a journalist. And it was awesome. I loved it, except it was the mid 2000s, 2006 to 2010, and the journalism industry was going through a really hard time. I managed to persevere and push through, and I got the opportunity to cover politics and work in the field that I love for 10 years. I did everything from radio to podcasts, multimedia journalism, covered elections, all kinds of things, loved every minute of it. But the industry was changing and I wanted some stability. And so a friend passed me a link to a job application with Treasury Board at the Canadian Digital Service. And I thought to myself, this is a dream job. There is no way I am ever going to get this job on my first try. But I decided to apply anyway. And I got it. And I spent almost 2 years at the Canadian Digital Service, loved it, and have just recently moved over to Employment and Social Development Canada to help them set up their digital channel for Service Canada. So I love everything digital. I love serving the public and doing anything I can to help have an impact. And yeah, just seem to be at the right place at the right time. So over to whoever is next.
Yeah, let's go with Alyssa. Thank you, Yael.
Okay, I don't know how to go after that, but so my name is Alyssa. So I want to tell you a story today. So I'm a wife and I'm a mom to 3 amazing kids. And I'm a dedicated public servant. I'm also an avid hiker, as you can see by all the mud. I'm also an amateur CrossFitter. These are the things that I purposely choose to cultivate in my life to become. But before I was all of those things, I was a painfully shy little girl. And I spent most of my time inside reading books. I loved stories. I fell in love with words and the way that they could be used to create something wonderful. But as time went on, as I got older, I realized that I desperately wanted to connect with people and discuss these big ideas that I had from reading these stories. But to do that, I had to get out of my comfort zone. So I chose to do the scary thing and become the hero of my own story. And a few years ago, I started taking jobs that required me to talk to people and talk to people often. Many people, hundreds and even thousands of people at a time. And what I found was they were actually listening to me and they were inspired by what I was saying and they were following me. And it turns out that all of those years spent inside on sunny days reading stories paid off, even though my eyesight is failing because of it. And so today I'm here with you at the Federal Youth Network's Career Boot Camp, sharing my wisdom about storytelling. And I'm part of a wonderful network of people who share and discuss big ideas. I couldn't be happier. That's my story.
Thank you, Alyssa. Justin, over to you.
Well, I have to follow that, so that's
Yes, you do. both amazing stories thus far. Yes, I know you're going to rock it.
Well, I'm going to change what I thought I was going to say, so that's cool though. But this is good. So my name is Justin. I am a public servant. I've been in public service for the last 5 years. I did my undergrad in Canadian politics and my master's in Canadian politics because I seem to really like it. At the time, I actually wanted to initially be a prof, and I met some academics and the way that they communicated really bugged me. And so I decided to take another route, which was to be a comedian. So I actually moved to Ottawa to pursue this sort of intersection between journalism and comedy. And in the meantime, I ended up getting a sort of casual gig over at immigration, sort of in like a millennial purgatory, just to, pay some bills and manage the precarious employment situation that I was in. One of my earliest experiences in public service was actually working on Operation Syrian Refugee. So that's the Syrian refugee crisis. And that and meeting some really awesome people changed my perspective on the public service. I started to see it as an actual career. And what I ended up doing was, instead of just kind of applying to a bunch of jobs, I decided to meet people and hear their stories, but also to kind of build my own. And so I ended up connecting with a bunch of awesome people. I cold emailed a lot. I think I emailed like 350 or something people, met with probably 200 in like the small scope of, I'd say, 8 months, and ended up getting a job leading a student pilot project on student recruitment using social media. Had a coffee with another director. Funny enough, through Lily, so she's on here, through Lily, who I'd also met and connected, and we shared our stories. So I was doing, I got a job at PCO working on the Beyond 2020 initiative, and then landed another virtual coffee with another director. And as of today, I'm an analyst working on the COVID digital communications team within PCO. That's my story. You're on mute, Jody.
Sorry about that. I was about to say that I think you folks met the challenge in terms of a 1-minute story of yourself, or at least how you wanted to choose to introduce yourselves. And I wanted to just touch on a couple of quick things. The idea around which slice of your life you chose to incorporate as part of your story. So as Justin was speaking, but I was listening, so I was multitasking. I just drew this. It's a pretty mediocre sort of table or a circle. The nicer versions are what they call a wellness wheel. And wellness wheels, if you Google it, will come up between 6 slices and 8 slices with a number of things that are believed to sort of encapsulate wellness. And they'll include things like, as Alyssa spoke to, family, physical health, or as Yael and Justin spoke to in terms of career and what that looks like. So there's different slices of your life that you can pull from and build from in terms of how you're going to tell a story, when you're going to tell the story, and the intent behind that. And in terms of where you're at. So think about, interestingly, when someone asks you, do an introduction, I you almost always start with what I do, which is I'm a public servant. Through my own living through life and experiences, I now find myself, the first thing I always say is that I'm a mom. And then I'll go on to say more things about how I choose to be versus what I am. And so think about that perhaps as you continue to listen and hear our panelists talk about their use of storytelling very sort of mindfully, and that there's very much layers as opposed to just maybe what words to say, that there's true intention behind which parts of your life you're pulling from. So to begin with that, or with sort of to follow up on that, I'd love to sort of start with Yael and look to the idea around, okay, like if there's just like a framework, like just sort of like, A to Z or A to BC, whatever it is, what's your experience and your sort of maybe recommendations on a kind of framework that folks might want to consider to use, and maybe based on your experience, what you've used to help write your story?
So there are a lot out there. There's no one size fits all approach. If you Google how to tell a great story or storytelling framework, you'll probably find as many answers as there are people on this call. But there are a couple of key elements that can really help build a story, especially if you're starting from scratch and not really sure where to start. So I would suggest that the best place to start is with the biggest, broadest kind of idea you can think of. So finding what's your big idea. So if you're working for an organization, it might be your mission or your mandate statement or your vision statement. If you're telling a very personal story, it might be what do you see as sort of your big life goal, or the biggest thing that you're working towards. Anything that's kind of broad enough in scope to kind of cover a whole spectrum of experiences and life events. And then I would suggest take that big macro picture, zoom right in down on something smaller. Pick a moment in time. Think of your life as that timeline, or your career as that timeline, and ask yourself, what's kind of the most interesting or surprising or challenging moment in this kind of journey? So that's the second thing, is kind of zooming in on a point in time. And then I think in order to tell a great story, you have to know your audience. They're the other side of that coin. You can't really tell a great story if you don't have someone to receive it. So learning about your audience, asking yourself, who are they? What are their characteristics? What are their interests? What do they need? What are they looking to accomplish when they go and seek out information, or when they come to hear something from you? And then I would say every great story has a narrative. So you're gonna kind of walk through a series of events, what happened. It's gonna have a setting of some sort, whether that's a government setting or a very personal setting or a virtual setting, wherever these activities are taking place. And you're gonna have characters, you're gonna have people. At the heart of every good story is human beings with all of their complexities. So as you're telling your story, think about describing your characters. It could be yourself, you could be telling a story about somebody else, a friend, a colleague, a family member, a famous person. So think about what is it about them that might engage or interest your audience. And then the last piece, and this is really sort of simplifying the elements here, but the last piece that I would suggest every good story should have is some kind of a call to action or a kicker, like something at the very end of your story where if the people who've listened to your story have taken nothing else away, what's the one thing that you'd like to leave them with? One thought, one action that they can hopefully take, something to inspire them or leave them wanting more. So in a nutshell, those are sort of my elements.
Love that. Thank you very much. I love the idea around how you sort of started with thinking about internal first. Okay, so what's internally, where am I at? What's my big idea? And then thinking about, okay, in terms of crafting, there's an external piece, of course, right? So someone's going to be hearing my story, whether that be in writing or whether that be verbally. And so thinking about who it is, and recognizing that how you might say it may need to be crafted so that it will be heard. My mom would always say to me, and still does sometimes, and she'd say it in Punjabi, which is my native language, and she'd say "Put," which means dear. She's like, you can say anything to anybody as long as you know how to say it. And her reference point was my dad, because he's like the worst person to communicate with. But she'd always say that there was this art around, she knew him, knew what he was like, knew what words to say so that she could be heard. So I really love that you said that. The other piece that I just wanted to connect was that I was reading a book, and I forget the author's name, but he's in BC, and he was sharing a story about how he went to do a talk and said something that like completely landed flat. And it was because he didn't do his homework on who was going to be in the room. And so I really appreciate you focusing on that piece. And the big idea that you want to leave somebody with, or what you choose in terms of your story and connecting with them. I'd like to turn that sort of thought over to Alyssa, and thinking about what makes a good story. And both with the idea of you being the receiver. So if you can recall a time when you heard a story that you're like, that was a good story, or what you believe, how you prepare, kind of maybe even thinking about Yael's example on this is why you told the story the way you did, because you feel like it will be a good story. So maybe in both ways, if you can share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Some of the things that Yael was saying, I'll probably cover them again because they're so great, but I want to add on to what she was saying. So there's some really great courses out there from IDOU on storytelling and giving presentations, and they talk a lot about what's your big idea and what's your call to action, right? So those should be your bookends, absolutely. When it comes to your second question there, Jody, about what makes a good story, personally, I think there's three things that make a really great story. And the first one is a good story brings out an emotional response, okay? So you should be striving to make your audience feel something, right? they're going to forget the words that you use, but they're not going to forget how you made them feel, right? And that goes back to that call to action. They're not going to remember your charts, your graphs, your data, your statistics. They're not going to remember that, even if you have data that's shocking. So you might elicit a response, but they're not going to remember that. You should be using that to support your story, but it shouldn't be the story, okay? We're really, really good as humans from disconnecting from data and statistics. We see it happening right now with the death rates with COVID-19. We disconnect from that. However, if you tell a human story, the life story of one of those people who have perished because of COVID-19, that's when people start paying attention and listening, because we're hardwired to respond to stories. So remember that people remember the human element of stories, so tell human stories. And Yael was saying that. Number two, I think a really good story connects the audience to the story and the storyteller. So make sure you know your audience. Make sure you know your audience and you find a way to connect with them, right? So don't discount the power of actually making a connection with the audience. It is a little bit more difficult when you're doing it virtually, but play with it, practice with it, because it's so important. I really tried to do that when I gave my introduction story. I'm sure at some point in that story, each and every one of you connected with one piece of that. And that's what you need to do, right? Number three, I think a really good story paints a picture, okay? You really need to help them see what you're trying to explain, right? Picture's worth 1,000 words, right? A really good example of this is a few years ago, I'm sure you all remember the picture of the 3-year-old Syrian boy who drowned and washed up on shore of the Mediterranean Sea. And that picture made headlines, and it did more to tell the story of the European refugee crisis than any other story that had been told. So use visuals. I tried to include a few little visuals in my story today, because you'll remember me picking up the kettlebell, and you'll be like, oh yeah, she's into fitness. You'll remember that more than me saying, oh, I'm a CrossFitter. So in summary, those three things, make sure that it brings out an emotional response, that you connect to your audience, and make sure you connect the audience to your story, and that your story paints a picture for them. That's what I would say makes a great story.
Love it. Thank you. A couple of things one, I saw the strategy behind your intro, and I thought, oh, that's interesting that she's purposely looking and showing props. And so I like that idea around being very mindful of, and not just the words that you're going to use, but the imagery or the stats, and what's the intent of that. And it perhaps, like you say, the story that can be told verbally or in writing is meant to paint a picture. And I thought when you were speaking, a picture says 1,000 words or something with that quote. I think is a really important piece to it, because sometimes we rely on our PowerPoint presentations and we rely on filling it with all this sort of stats and data and visuals, and the human piece in terms of resonating with people, whether it be a positive or negative feeling, is important in terms of intent. And I share that with you because as you were speaking, I felt nothing but just love as you spoke, Alyssa, in your intro and even now in your response, and the resonating of, we share many things in common. And so there was this sort of feeling of home as you were speaking. I remember seeing a TED Talk where the title was How You Can Empathize with Terrorists. And just the title alone, you can bet, was meant to elicit some sort of emotional response. And so I think it's important to see the balance between the intent of the story and the impact that you're looking at. And with impact, I wanted to turn our next question over to Justin. And thinking about this idea around impact, if you could describe a time, this sounds like an interview question, right? Can you describe a time when? If you can describe a time when either you heard a story that resonated very strongly with you, or you told a story that you believe was really impactful, or both.
Yeah, I think the best way to answer how a story has resonated or impacted me is probably to tell you the story that's probably resonated or impacted me. So there's like this story from a couple years ago in 2017, and it's the story of Ellen and Jason and their public servants at ISET. Jason is also happens to be a 5-time medalist for Canada in the Paralympics and lives with a visual impairment. So it often takes Jason some time to get a feel for the space. And he had just recently joined Ellen's team over at ISET. He actually went into the wrong office looking for Ellen. And once they had found each other, Ellen gave Jason a tour, hand in arm, of the office floor. And then he mentioned to Ellen that he didn't realize that the office was that big. And that gave Ellen a really neat idea. Build a tactile sort of 3D map of the office space with different textures to sort of represent different areas. So she got a hold of an exact to scale floor plan, and then she went home and she broke out her daughter's arts and crafts kit. Went to Michael's as well and built a prototype of the office space using that exact to scale floor plan. Then she started thinking about 3D printing and to be able to produce something a little bit more sophisticated, but also sort of standardize the representation of a space in textured format. So she started making calls. She called someone over at NRCC who worked on 3D printing, and he actually built the map. What's really cool about that story is because that's actually not the end of the story, but it could be. PCO featured that story and turned it into a video for the 2018 Clerk Report. And the story got the attention of a DG over at PSPC, who ended up reaching out to Ellen to explore how PSPC could do something similar for Centre Block and Parliamentary Precinct. And then it brought similar discussions in other departments like FAC and even other jurisdictions, including the US Congress and I think New Zealand, to build more inclusive and accessible public spaces. So why that resonate? I think it's covered a little bit in everything that Yael spoke to, as well as Alyssa. For me, it was a couple of things. It highlighted a challenge or a problem. Sometimes it's a challenge or problem we don't often think of. But that challenge actually began from the perspective of an individual person. It wasn't a system, it wasn't an organization, there was a face to a problem. And it started from that sort of place of relatability. So like I might not be able to fully experience what it means to be visually impaired, but with that story, I can sort of empathize with how that may have felt, especially that experience from being a new employee in that team and not being able to navigate my own office space. It also got into the how and in quite some detail. We didn't just arrive at the solution. We were able to like picture that journey. So like the thought of Ellen cracking open her daughter's arts and crafts set. It also told us a lot about Ellen, who Ellen was as a person. There was character development. She's someone that's not just really, really empathetic, but also someone who was empowered enough to take initiative of her own accord, picking up the phone and calling people she didn't know, whether it was in her own organization or outside. And I think the next thing was the sort of resolution. It wasn't just a tactile map for Jason in his new workplace environment. And as I mentioned, that could have been the end of the story there. But it did lead to a discussion that uncovered the need for more tactile maps, not just in Canada, but well beyond Canada. And I think lastly would have been almost leaving a sense of like wanting to uncover more. When I had first heard that story, the subsequent part of that story, I had so many questions. Like how far did that story travel? Where else did it go? Where it might have else been like a catalyst for inclusive and accessible spaces. So like I think in addition to exactly what Yael and Alyssa have already mentioned, it seems to start with the relatable protagonist, sets out a problem or a conflict. It digs into the details of the journey, the how, and it has a pretty impactful resolution that speaks to you, but could also speak to others.
Love that. Thank you very much. I'm going to try something different, sort of spontaneous. One word answer on what's needed from within to be able to tell a good story, starting with Alyssa.
Vulnerability.
Vulnerability. Thank you. Yael?
Listening.
Okay. And Justin?
Empathy.
Empathy. Thank you. And the reason I wanted to ask in one word was as we're hearing responses from our amazing panelists, and Justin, just to pick up on a point that you said, the system, and it's not a process, it's the person. I often joke about as a free agent, I'm a petri dish within a larger petri dish. And I really truly believe that as humans, we are a system, a very complex and beautiful system within many larger systems. And so when you think about storytelling, what I heard as we've been chatting is things like out of your comfort zone. Alyssa said that initially in her comment. Outside of the one word answer, Justin, you actually used the word empathy in sharing the story around impact. And Yael, you talked about the idea about what's the big idea internally, what is it that you want to share? And so I think it's important that you can have these frameworks that go to the external. Here's how to tell a good story. The idea around what's needed underneath, vulnerability, courage, listening skills. You know how when we listen, we're already thinking about a question that we want to ask. Well, if you're doing that, you're actually not listening. And empathy. So you need to sort of think about how that plays for you as a person who's about to possibly tell a story. And I used to be deathly afraid of reading out loud in school. I never spoke, even in university. I never even used to ask questions. And it was always the idea that I don't want people to think I'm stupid. So I had negative talk that I was listening to that impeded my ability to even learn and let alone share. And so when we think about this idea about when we tell a story and why we're telling the story, I'd like to throw this back to Yael around how have you used storytelling in your career?
Yeah, and I might be poking into the Q&As a little bit too, and looking at some people's questions. And there's a lot of interest there in how to use some of these skills in interviews or in reaching out to prospective, new managers or colleagues. And I think I've used storytelling in every interview, in every cover letter, in every initial informal email or coffee chat that I've had with a potential colleague or manager or just someone in my career. And I do that by listening, first of all, like to try to find out what they're looking for in a role that they're trying to fill, or what their mission or goal or vision for their workplace is. And I try to think, okay, I'm taking in that information, I'm processing all of this information about them, about how they see themselves, about how they see their job. And then I'm thinking, okay, how can I relate this to myself? And do I have some stories of things that I've done in my career that speak to what they're saying? And you can always make connections. There's always a story that you can tell. There's always something that you've had experienced in your life, in your career, that can relate to some emotion or some experience that they've had, because so much of this is universal, right? So for example, when I interviewed for the Canadian Digital Service, I had no government experience whatsoever, but I had all of this experience being on the outside of government as a journalist looking in. And so I told a lot of stories about how, as a journalist, I saw this happen or saw that happen or experienced this change, and what I thought of that as a journalist and how I conveyed that information to the public, and how that turns into a skill, right, as an employee, of being able to think strategically about how the media relations kind of machinery might work and how you might engage with journalists or external audience, or how we might leverage social media, because I had been on that side of things. So there's always a way to connect, and there's always a way to listen to what an employer might need, and then use your storytelling abilities in an interview or in a resume. Use that narrative kind of structure to build up to some excitement about you as a person and as a potential hire. Every resume is an opportunity to kind of lay out your own mission statement, your own big idea, like up at the top of your resume. Like, who are you in a nutshell? What are you trying to accomplish in your career? And then every work experience that you're building in over time should be helping to tell that story of how you're trying to become, that vision of yourself. So it might sound different for a lot of people, like you're not used to maybe thinking of your resume or structuring it that way. But if you think about what people, like, your hiring managers are just people too, right? And they're just looking to connect with some information that resonates with them. And everybody wants to work with people that they like and that they enjoy and that they get along with. And so making yourself personable, telling stories, through those hiring processes can really help leave an impression.
I love it. I was thinking about my own personal experience with staffing in the public service. So I have a recruitment background, and so many times folks would come and ask, like, how do I get screened in? How do I answer this question? Because, to be honest, a lot of the questions are really dry. Like, I'm not involved in recruitment anymore, but it was very much like, there's got to be a right answer. And it was almost like a cookie cutter robotic response. And I love the way you described, like, almost what I heard was owning your story and just not being afraid to take it from, find a nicely formatted resume, but pull from that how you can show how amazing you are. And I know, as a public servant and somebody in HR with sort of the background ideas around when you read a resume, I'm always encouraged when I see people really showing up on paper in terms of, here's who I am, here's why I exist, here's what I want to do, and not being afraid of that. If the system doesn't accept that, meaning you get screened out, then I think that's more an indicator of the system being broken, not your courage and vulnerability to show up and say who you are. So I wanted to just throw that out there, because it's not necessarily easy to put yourself out there and say, here's my mission, here's my bit, here's what I want to accomplish. And to be able to somehow weave that in on describe a time when you had to prioritize might seem odd or challenging, but give it a go and see what happens. Like, what's the harm, right? And then also, don't beat yourself up if you don't get, 10 out of 10 on it, because maybe that's the system's issue and not yours. I'm curious, Alyssa, just to jump a little bit on what Yael was saying around pulling from stories or your life experiences. And if you could share a little bit about, if you can remember, what it was like as a free agent or applying for the free agent program, and sort of connecting how that application process went and how it allowed you to maybe be your more authentic self. If you could share that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when Yael was speaking, that's what I was thinking of. I was thinking of how liberating it was to go through the free agent process, where I could be creative with my resume, with my submission, where I could bring my whole self to the table and really show all of myself. So it's not just, where did I go to school? What degree do I have? What roles have I had in the government? It was really, who am I? And like Yael said, like these hiring managers, they're people too, and they want to connect with you. They haven't had the opportunity yet in the way our systems are set up, but we are the ones who can change those systems, right? And the way we shift them is to have the courage, have the vulnerability to show up and say, I'm going to do it a little bit differently, because I believe this is a better way, and people will follow. They will see that it is a better way. But yeah, it was really liberating to be able to share my story in a selection process for the free agent program. Absolutely. Thank
you for sharing that. I had the same feeling when I applied, and I think it's, again, an important piece in terms of when you're looking at career and thinking about how you're wanting to connect with people, whether that be for getting a job or you're in the job and you're now like doing it. Thinking again about what the panelists have talked about in terms of being deliberate about the setup of the story, the human connection piece, the empathy piece, the impact, and almost what Justin described to me was sort of like a call. What's the call to action? Which could be a simple question, but maybe it's not even a simple question. Maybe it's just based on the entire story. The call of action is the last piece that you say, which is just thank you. But because you shared this story and this narrative in a real powerful way, including the emotional piece and the passion, you didn't have to actually have a question that says like, what are you going to do as the call for action? The story itself almost becomes the call to action. I'm wondering if just from I know that there's quite a few questions that have come out in the Q&A, and I'm wondering if we can turn to that. I can see some of them. Yes.
Can I just dovetail on something because I feel
Yeah.
animated. So like we've had a really awesome conversation about like, well, one, the pains of the recruitment model in the public service, and I shared my story with intention because it seems to be like you've got this job application open, it takes you a couple of days, you fill out these words, then you wait months on end to hear back, you might have to write an exam, then you come in for an interview, and then at the tail end, you get that right fit interview. And like, that's where you get a sense of like the culture of the organization, the culture of the team, the culture of the people, and what the people that you potentially work with and look like. Part of the reason that like I have like, and I hate this process too, but part of the reason like I have been pretty vocal about cold emailing, coffee connecting is I'm convinced that you can actively move that right fit interview to the beginning of the process if you do it by yourself. And that's been the most successful for me in landing not just jobs that I wasn't sure I wanted, but jobs I was sure I wanted with people I wanted to work for. And then the last thing I'll say is maybe that I think we're all storytellers. How we storytell in the workplace and the career aspect of things, I think that's something we're all kind of working on and developing. But if we're all innately storytellers, the suggestion is very simple. We can apply what we do. We talk to our friends, our parents, our loved ones, our colleagues, and we share awesome stories or terrible ones. But we do get some reaction. We do elicit a response. We get what we're looking for. The application is very much the same in the career and workplace environment, and the importance of knowing your audience. Anyways, I just wanted to share that, and maybe we can jump into the Q&A.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. And it's funny because one of the questions that our participants have is directed towards you, and you mentioned not cold coffees or whatever, but the question actually is, Justin, do you have any advice on how to cold email people? I would like to do so, but I'm unsure what to say. So I feel like you kind of almost went there, but maybe some top 3 tips on how to actually even craft the email. Like, what would you say in the email if you don't even know the person?
It's the same principle as knowing your audience. So like, you'll have a sense based on the person, the title, the organization. You'll get a glimpse of it. You can probably find them on LinkedIn. You can, if you find them on social media, look at what they're sharing, look at what they're talking about. And if you know someone in the organization or someone who might know them, pick up the phone and be like, hey, I really want to talk to this person. I think I might be interested in their work and I might have a value add. So 1, know your audience. 2, don't ever like unsolicitedly put out a CV. Like, you want to convey some value add. So I think a short email, a hook would be like, I know you work on this. I'm interested in like thinking about this. And I'd like to grab a virtual coffee. Would you spare some time? So short, catchy hook, and don't make it feel like it's transactional. Like, you want to authentically meet these people. So to do just that.
Yeah, Beautiful. Alyssa or Yael, anything to add when it comes to that idea around almost what sounds like, what do they call that? Value proposition or like a pitch? Don't just send a cold email or a cold resume. Maybe Alyssa first, anything to add to what Justin just said around tips?
Yeah, I would just say like everything that Justin said, 100%. I mean, and there is value in using your ability to speak to people and connect with people to build a really solid network. And then your network does the work for you, right? We talk a lot about networking. And when I first started, like I said, a few years ago, I said, you know what, I'm going to take the jobs where I have to talk to people and it's scary, but that's okay. We've talked, I was trying to do networking. And I thought, oh, networking has got such a bad rap because, like Justin said, a lot of people look at it as a transaction. It should not be a transaction. I now have an incredible network. And the reason why I love them is because I actually love them. They are my friends. It's not a transaction, right? We support each other. You can use storytelling to connect with people to build that network. So that's all I'll say on that.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yael?
Yeah, I would add on top of all of, I +1 to all of that, and that there's some work that you can do in advance on your own if you're interested to put yourself out there a little bit so that when you do connect with someone through an email, if they go and do the opposite research about you, they actually have some things to find, to discover, kind of like leaving a little trail of breadcrumbs about yourself. Online, virtually, this is the world we live in now. If you're comfortable on social media, if you want to start a blog on Medium or another platform, if you've ever thought about starting a newsletter about a topic that you're interested in, and creating a little mailing list through MailChimp or some other tool, and writing some stuff and putting it out into the world, to help build the narrative about yourself and what you're interested in and who you are and how you work. A lot of people use their Twitter feeds that way. A lot of people curate their online spaces that way, so that in an authentic way, you're helping make it easier for people to learn about you at their own pace. This way, also in the way Alyssa was mentioning, like building your network, you're letting some of these artifacts that you've created speak for themselves, and then people will start to come and find you. You won't always have to do all of that hard work eventually of cold calling and reaching out, and as you mature into your career and gain that confidence in yourself, to put things out into the world that you've created, to build that sort of online portfolio, your own online website, get your LinkedIn page to a place where you feel like really great about what it says about you. People will come and start knocking on your door, and that's a really nice feeling too. But in those early stages, yes, it is a lot of reaching out to finding mentors, finding people that you respect. And I think it comes back to thinking about what your big picture is, and trying to align, like maybe don't reach out to hundreds of people, but maybe think like very intentionally about who you really admire and what areas you really want to work in the public service. Do your research and then target those efforts, but give it your all, right? So it's more about quality over quantity.
Love it. Thank you very much. And I just, again, as a public servant, I used to work for the RCMP, and I remember feeling like I was this, I don't mean this in a bad way, but almost like brainwashing you not to be on social media. Like this is RCMP, and there's, the idea around confidentiality and just being careful about like, if you put yourself out there, what might happen in terms of the information being used, in not the best way. And even in this day and age, when we talk about as public servants and putting ourselves out there in social media, I still sometimes worry that there's this hesitation that people feel because they're not sure what they're allowed to say. And so I feel like from the way the three of you have described it, it almost is it's like giving yourself the freedom to say, I'm a human being and I've got stuff to say that's really personal and that's my thoughts and my views. without compromising the values and ethics code, but there's a way to do that. So, you know, on LinkedIn, and maybe it's a website, like you say, Yael, or Justin, as you say, you know, being strategic about, well, do the research on the title and the work that the person's doing, and, you know, and then connect with them instead of just sending your resume. I think is an important thing to highlight, because I think a lot of folks are sometimes concerned about, well, what can I say or not say on social media? And maybe our HR world needs to catch up a little bit more. But if you look at other sectors, LinkedIn is being used instead of your resume and your cover letter. Like, recruiters are going to LinkedIn first. So to build from your network, something to think about in terms of your narrative as it relates to career. There's a fun question I feel like I'd love to ask the three of you, and it's around books that you've read that you have enjoyed, whether it be nonfiction or fiction. And if you could share that. I would like to go first, because there's one that I read on Audible. So I didn't read it, I listened to it, but it was there's a TED book out there, TED Talk book, around how to do a TED Talk. And it was fabulous. Like, it gave so many strong tips and ideas, things like a through line. What does that mean? What does that look like? Whether you should use humor or not, whether you should or shouldn't use visuals. When will you use visuals? So it was a really good book in terms of what we're talking about today. And the other works that I've picked up that I've been reading a lot of is Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde was an activist, a feminist Black lesbian activist in the US. And her poetry and her articles are just so profound that in the world where we're looking at beautiful social justice movements exploding based on the continual death of our Black fellow humans and George Floyd's murder, reading what she's written, it brought me to tears sometimes. So I just wanted to share that. Let's go with Justin first. Fiction or not fiction, some of the favorite authors or books that you've read?
I like consume way too much nonfiction. I honestly can't tell you the last time I consumed like fiction. It's been a hot minute. And yeah, I know. It's a lot of like Canadian politics books. But I did want to share a resource that I think that's like really, really helped me like become a better storyteller. And it's from the Khan Academy. And they have Pixar in a box, and it's like the art of storytelling. I think I went through like the modules like probably 2 or 3 years ago. Still good as ever, like still fantastic. I rewatch it every now and then. Probably like I genuinely like probably like once every 6 months, and I'm like, oh right, I did that. I didn't do that. That's probably why that story didn't resonate with that particular audience. I think it's a great, fantastic resource. So I definitely wanted to share that with this crew. And they've probably heard of it. If you haven't, do check it out. I think it's awesome.
Okay, super, thank you. Alyssa, books or authors that you'd like to share with the audience?
So I read a lot of fiction, but I mean, I do believe that fiction is very important, because fiction it's human stories, right? So the more fiction you read, the more you're connecting with humans and human stories, and you're understanding how humans tick. The last book that I finished was Untamed by Glennon Doyle. So that's what came to my mind. And so the whole book is about finding the truest version of yourself and being courageous enough to do that. It's a big call to action, but it's really, really moving. In terms of nonfiction, actually, I'll share a nonfiction book. So this is my Bible about self-awareness. So I share it all the time. Yeah, Insight. Yeah. If you want to get to know who you are better, read this book. Yeah.
Thanks, Alyssa. I'm just laughing because I read Untamed as well. Just bought that book because I'm doing some curriculum design for the Canada School on self-awareness. There's a free test you can take through Dr. Elrich's website to help you with sort of figuring out your self-awareness and stuff. Yael, books, fiction, nonfiction, authors.
I'm going to change the format on you and go podcasts because that's my format of choice these days. Home cooking, a podcast about what it sounds like, home cooking, is brilliant and hilarious. And it's dotted with these just delightful stories about how recipes and food and the sharing of food and the passing down of recipes through cultures is just like connected to kind of who we are as people, and it's lovely. And it's a funny story of how a 4-part series turned into like a 12-part podcast. And then the other one is going way, way, way back. If you've never listened to Serial, which was the NPR podcast, if you're into true crime at all, or if you're not, and you're looking for something different, the way that that story is woven with different characters and different perspectives, and the idea that memory can kind of play tricks on us over time, and what we remember to be true a long time ago in different versions, and the whole idea of like who is the reliable narrator, like who can you trust in telling stories. It's brilliant. So podcasts, if you're looking for something different, podcasts are always a fun way to kind of switch it up. And I think it's a great medium for storytelling because it's intimate. It's like in your ear, gets inside your head, hopefully touches something a little closer to your heart too.
Love it. Thank you. I remember in the 9th grade, Mr. Jefferson, my teacher, had given me The Prince by Machiavelli. And he had said, just think about the way this is written, and, the ends justify the means is the famous quote that I think comes from that book. But he talked about what we consume in terms of knowledge and information and stories. And at that time, 9th grade was a long time ago, folks, right, for me. But I love, Yael, that you turned to, what you read, what you listen to, or what you see, as Alyssa said, in terms of fiction, even documentaries and stories that are, there's not so much Hollywood, Bollywood going on with the pandemic, but during the pandemic, we were watching certain true life stories with our children. One was Gandhi. And so we were able to share our history as, British occupation. And there was another one called The Great Debaters, which was Denzel Washington sharing. So you talk about storytelling and narrative. It was students, young Black students in North Carolina, I think, who telling the story of how they became one of the best debating teams in North America through with there still being separation and racism and things like that going on in the US. So I love that you folks went from not just fiction, but looking at the idea of where that fiction and nonfiction can come from, and that definitely there's more out there other than just sort of what you read or what you read. So thank you for that. We've got about 3 minutes left, and there is one question that I think would be good to answer in a couple of sentences, and it could be either within the public service, and Alyssa, you already gave a tip, but any courses or reading materials or things that you think would be really helpful for folks to learn about, again, how to tell a good story. Justin, we'll go with you, whether it be within the public service or something else that you've done that has helped you and your ability to storytell.
Yeah, I think I jumped the shark because I jumped into the chat here a little bit. So the first one is Radical Candor. I'm sure everyone here's heard of it, but Radical Candor is fantastic. It's taught me how to empathize with people concretely, be very, very explicit, but also be very gentle and vulnerable all at the same time. I think it's fantastic, and I imagine it's particularly compelling when you're telling a challenging story.
Yeah,
so
love
I think
it. That's Kim Scott. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Alyssa, courses, tips, whether it be within the public service or outside.
I actually took, it's not within the public service, but it was paid for by my host department right now. It's called Think on Your Feet training. Most of you may have heard of it. So it's not necessarily storytelling, but if what you're trying to do is use stories to have a great elevator pitch, be able to, think on your feet and tell your story when you're meeting a new potential boss. Think on Your Feet training is really great. They focus on teaching you how to use clarity, brevity, and impact. And I know for me, I can tell a great story, but it's really, really long and convoluted. So I had to work on the brevity piece. So I would highly recommend that course. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that. And Yael, we'll end with your thoughts on courses within or outside of the public service.
Yeah, I'll give the Canada School of Public Service some love. They've got some offerings, and I know they're working on a great storytelling course, particularly related to decks. So how to make your deck stand out and take a more narrative approach and use more visuals to actually tell a story, as opposed to just like we talked about, you know, lots of statistics and charts and graphs that don't really resonate or leave quite the impression that you want them to. Considering how much time a lot of public servants spend on decks, writing decks, making decks, reading decks, and how many of them often get left, you know, behind unread or forgotten. That would be a good one, I think. Reaching out, seeing what the Canada Public School has to offer. They've got really great course offerings. So that's one I think is in the works. I'm not sure if they're offering it yet, but it would be on storytelling and with a focus, I think, on decks.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. It's so funny. I just put that in the chat before you said it. So my last gig as a free agent was with the Canada School, and one of my colleagues was creating not this one, but a different one on literally like how to do storytelling. So that is coming out. I saw the deck one as well. I don't know if it's out yet. And there's a few others. There's even one that says how to deliver a 2-minute pitch. Which has existed before. So, you know, just popping onto the website and seeing what's available. And there's a lot of really cool work being done by some wonderfully talented content developers at the school, who I really feel like get what we're looking for in terms of how to be more human in the workplace, and are trying to put out content that we feel, or that they feel is really going to be strong and helpful for folks. I think that's time for us. And I think, Josh, do I turn it over to you to sort of close out officially? We're over by a minute, so I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thanks very much to Jody for moderating, to all our panelists for joining us today. So again, continue to share your thoughts using the hashtag CBC_CDC. If you go back to the virtual expo platform, that will list the rest of our program for the day. The next session is at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's an amazing discussion that we're going to have with Anna Wong, Sarah Paquette, and Manon Brassard. And then our next session after that is at 3:30. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your career bootcamp experience. Merci beaucoup. Bonne journée.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jody.